Hello, good day. Welcome again to the Peatland Exchange series from the World Soil Museum. Let me try to manage the slides here. Just a moment, please. Yeah. So the Peat Exchange series is related to the artist in residency of environmental artist Kate Foster. And the World Soil Museum collaborates with artists on the broader topic of soils to create awareness, facilitate dialogue, learning and exchange, and stimulate engagement and curiosity, wonder, exploration, and enjoyment. So that's a mouthful. And we are very happy to have Kate Foster as the artist in residence this year. And this residency includes, amongst other, the Peatland Exchange series, so of which it's a series of 4 with lectures and presentations and discussion. And this is the 3rd one in that series. Also, we have an exhibit in the museum and other engagements and dialogue events. And there are various partners involved, Wet Futures, Home Turf, the Drents Museum, and of course, ISRIC World Soil Information. And in the museum, we have connected to this series as well exhibits of things related to peat art exhibits from Kate's work, and that is changes over time. So inspiring and mind-tickling things like the beautiful display you see here, the shadow play, and all things related to peat and peat cultures. So do come to the museum and interact with Kate if you are in the position to. So this time we'll talk about reviewing cultural histories. That is the theme of this 3rd Peat Exchange series. And for each of the series, I took the opportunity to show you some object of the museum. And I would like to do that now as well. This is a slide I borrowed from the presentation of Roy. It's a former boortangermoor. And I actually discovered that we have a peat soil from that area, from the Bargeveen. So that's a remnant of the original peat from the boortangermoor. And in the field, it looked like that. So you see the landscape picture. You see the wall where we found a piece of intact peatland. And we see peat bricks there too. Well, and as I mentioned in the previous introductions, peatlands have a variety of functions, including, well, you see a list here of methodology, so the formation and properties of peatland, ecological, hydrological, landscape values, cultural aspects of peatland, of which we will talk today as well, and history and archaeology. Now, this is the peat profile as was excavated in the Bargeveen, and I'm going to shift to my mobile camera to show you. On mute.
Stop sharing.
Okay. So this is this peat profile, but now prepared with lacquer as a monolith, and this is a peat profile from the Bargeveen. So wonderful specimens showing the peat in its full extent. And yeah, so this is a very typical profile from the Netherlands. Let me now shift to the camera again. And one thing I discovered is that they have in that area a black turf. And one of the things connected to that, and actually an industry that developed in this area, is Norit. It's this product that you take. It's activated coal, and you take that when you feel bad. Your stomach, your bowels are infected by bacteria or by toxins, and actually, well, I never realized until very recently that this Norit is or at least was based on peat, excavated peat products. So yeah, interesting fun fact to know. But another thing, so that's the specimen of the Bargeveen. Another thing that's a question that came into my mind, I think it was based on a remark by Kate or one of the previous presentations, is the cultural perception of peat. And then I thought about, when did I first realize what a peatland is, and when did I first see a peatland, or a cultural landscape based on peatland. And actually, I was grown up in an area of empoldement, so I lived in polder areas in Delft, in the western part of the Netherlands, and actually you had peat areas there as well. And when I was playing as a kid, I jumped over ditches, and I saw, of course, the mills related to the hydrological management. And what I would find in many cases were these kind of at that time I was looking for these kind of artifacts, like old glass or porcelain pieces, but also clay pipes. I had a whole collection of clay pipes. But well, as a child, of course, I never realized how it came about that you could find that in the soil, and that it was really related to the history of that landscape and well, what the natural landscape actually was. I just took it for granted, and only when I was a student in university I became to realize well, actually more of it. And I think that's important to know, because you value the landscape and the soil much more when you understand its composition, its history, and the functions. But that's a bridge to some of the talks that we have here today, and I'll give the floor now to Maurice Paulissen. He's a PhD candidate in Wageningen University in the Cultural Geography group, and he'll talk about, the title of his talk is Hostile Ground or Valuable Land. So Maurice, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. Thank you, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the more recent history than in the previous two sessions. I'll be focusing on the late medieval to very recent period of history. And my talk will be about human use, perceptions, and contestation of raised bogs in the eastern part of the Netherlands. So if we look at previous historical research or historical geographical research that has been done on this part of Europe, then it's striking that a lot of that research is about the large-scale transformations of the landscape. You see on the left-hand side a map of the Netherlands at the beginning of the early modern age, and all the dark gray areas used to be raised bog at the time. If you see on the right-hand side, these are the remaining raised bog reserves, because they're all nature reserves nowadays in, again, the eastern part of the Netherlands. So a lot of these raised bogs have disappeared in the course of over 500 years. And a lot of historical and historical geographic academic research has focused on this big transformation. So that's logical from an economic and also from a cultural point of view. But I think there's a different understudied history that should be told as well and should be researched as well. And that's what I aim to do. And that's more about the extensive, less destructive, less disruptive ways that people have also interacted with raised bogs over time. And that also bridges to the remaining nature reserves we have right now, because these obviously have never been fully dug away. And let's say a main question in this research is, were those bogs really as hostile and economically marginal as often as claimed? Now I'm organizing my research around 4 themes. So it's different from a regional monography approach where you really dive into a certain research area. I have different areas, different examples to illustrate my cases. And I will just quickly run through those 4 themes first and then elaborate on each of them. I will not now discuss the scholarly or societal context of it, but we'll do that when I present on the specific theme. So the first one is on bogs as common lands. The second one is on bogs as natural or perceived natural barriers and historical borderlands. The third dives into the perception side of bogs. So how did humans perceive those landscapes, past but also present? I'll be mainly talking about past perceptions. And finally, we'll be looking at cultural remains. So what traces did those activities, relatively recent historical activities, leave at the surface of the present day bog landscapes, and how could we deal with that, with those traces? So to start with the first theme, bogs as common lands. Well, let me first introduce you to the concept of commons. So in political economy, there's 3 main ways that are distinguished in which tracts of land and resources can be managed. It's either through privatization, through the market, or they are state-owned and managed by a state body. But there's also a third way, and that's relatively small on this drawing, because at present in the Netherlands and also beyond in Europe, commons are not so common, are not so don't occur so often anymore. And that's the situation where a local community is actually responsible for managing its resources, that particular plot of land with its resources. And it's entitled to make its own regulations on how to govern the resource management. And according to theory, the commons theory, it's very autonomous in doing so. So it's not, ideally not, or theoretically not influenced by the market and also not by the state. And this type of land management and resource management was really important in this part of the world ever since the late medieval times, certainly also in early modern times, and until at least the 19th century. Think of all the big heathlands, boglands, other wetlands, forests also that we used to have. Many of them were managed as common lands. So local communities were in charge there. So if you translate that to the bogs we had in the Netherlands, and we either had these big tracts of bog that were sold to entrepreneurs that were privatized and then fully dug away commercially. So that's obviously the market there. And then the other mode in this bipolar model is that you have a common. So it's the local communities surrounding the bog landscape, governing and managing that landscape themselves and using the resources purely for their own private needs. So no commercialization, no selling there. And why would that be? Well, obviously, if there was too much commercialization going on, then you would have then these resources would be quickly exhausted. So it's a way to protect, to sustainably manage your resources for a longer time. So the specific theme I was interested in here was peat commercialization from bog commons. And that's considered a problem according to common pool resource theory for the reasons that I just explained. And we see also in the bylaws, these are the local regulations that the commoners made themselves for their area, that always in every bog I encountered in history, a commercialization of peat or other goods taken from these commons were strictly forbidden. Well, we had data on an example of the Bakelse gemeente, which is a tract of common land in the Noord-Brabant part of the Peel region. You see here a beautiful old map. In blue, you see the whole peat bogland area, a huge area at the time. I think it's a 17th or 18th century map. And here, the three white dots and the white circle are the 4 settlements that were entitled to use that particular common. So the bylaws of that common and also common pool resource theory says that only people from those 4 settlements were entitled to use the peat or other resources. But what did we see in practice? That peat was sold actually into a wide hinterland behind this area. And that did not only occur in those 6 years, but far beyond that. We know from the 18th century that peat was sold from the Bakelse gemeente common to the city of 's-Hertogenbosch to fuel breweries there, for example. So why would that be? If it is so strictly forbidden and also according to theory, why did it happen and for so long a time? Well, for those first years where we had a time series, we know that it was a time that, let's say, the end phase of the Dutch rising against the Spanish rule. So that was a very turbulent wartime, and there were high taxes, there were high community debts. So you can imagine that locals selling peat, they could bring in some extra money also to the community. And interestingly, whereas theory says that commons operate very autonomously, we saw in this case, in this time window, that the state actually interfered and even accommodated, approved those peat sales. So it seems that at that time there was a dire necessity for those sales. But we also see that also in more prosperous and peaceful times, there was a tradition of selling peat. It just continued. So it also seems to be a kind of opportunistic thing happening. And then interestingly, we've talked about external parties interfering, but if you look at what happens among the community of commoners, you can see in this certain rules, bylaw rules, and how they evolved. Bylaw rules concerning peat cutting and also peat sales. And they state there are particular fines to be paid if you breach that law. And of course, we know the concept of inflation. Over time, those fine amounts increase. And we see that here also. But when it comes to selling peat, we see interestingly that the fine amount decreases over time. So we don't know exactly what the reasoning behind it was, but it seems to be some negotiation to find an optimum between, you know, not allowing full commercialization because that would be the ruin of the common, but also to give room to those people who want it for whatever reason to still practice that. So to summarize this, we actually found a third way of peat extraction, so to say, because we have the classical model of you had either these large-scale commercial companies digging away your whole landscape, or you had the idyllic small-scale farmers cutting peat. We actually found an intermediate model, and interestingly, it was not only a hybrid form between commons and market, but there was also state influence there. So then turning to the second theme, which was bogs as natural barriers or perceived natural barriers and historical borderlands. So scientifically, a starting point here was the decline of the idea of environmental determinism. So around 1900, there were a lot of geographers that believed that nature could, in some cases, be coercive in determining human behavior and human agency. One example is that big rivers or mountain ridges were thought to be, per definition, to be natural borders, as they were called. Well, this idea is completely abandoned, has been completely abandoned by human geographers, and they now believe that borders are, in every instance, purely artificial constructs. Well, I was wondering, what about bog landscapes there? And we've studied this topic through the lens of affordance theory, and affordance theory actually is about the relationship between an object, or a landscape, if you will, and a person or a species, you could say even. So in case of a chair, well, it's without thinking, we know it's used for sitting, but let's say for another species, it's not usable. And this is a very simple way to illustrate it, but you can also apply this thinking to landscape. So it's a unique relation, species-specific unique relation that exists between a landscape, for example, and humans in this case. So imagine you were in this place, you were in the middle of this bog. It's actually a picture from Baltic State, because there you still have very nice bogs. And look at this landscape. You might see that on the left-hand side, there's a slight elevation. There seems to be kind of a drier ridge there. There's also trees on it, higher trees, whereas an intact raised bogs in these areas used to be non-forested. So you might think, okay, I better go to the left and then see if I continue, if there's another ridge that I can follow. So that way you're interacting, you're visually interacting, but not only visually, you're also sensing that, you know, the ground is more or less stable or unstable. So you're finding your way through the landscape. That's the idea behind affordances. So a bog could offer variable support and passage. So that's an affordance of the bog. Thereby it can function, we claim, as a natural barrier, not an absolute barrier, of course, because people have crossed bogs at all times, but a relative barrier. And it, of course, as we saw earlier, it also can supply all kind of resources. So these are affordances, things that the landscape affords, gives to people for better or worse. Yeah, okay. I had a different slide there showing just that this variability, that there is a variability over space and time in accessibility of a bog, for example. But I've skipped that one, so I was a little confused about that. I want to talk now more about these borders, so how they got in place. And the problem for us was that we hardly had any early medieval sources. So I'm working as a historian with written sources mainly, or map sources, or oral history recordings, but there was nothing there for the early medieval time relating to this subject. So what I'm showing you now is a little bit hypothetical, theoretical, but imagine you have a very big bog landscape. So the width of the bog here would be several kilometers. And you have villages forming around that bog already in early medieval time, as we know for this part of the world. And these village communities, they are forming on the mineral soils surrounding the bog. And these villages would be using their mineral soil environment, but also extensively using the bog early on. So it would be very unlogical, very unlikely that people from one side of the bog would cross all the way to the other side, because given it's not impossible, but it's a difficult hike to make, and use grounds on the opposite side of the bog. That would be very unlikely, we think, because there's already other settlements. So the situation you would then have is that initially you could have that there's enough for everyone in the bog landscape, because in early medieval time there was only a few people living here as compared to later periods. So there would probably be enough for everyone, but per definition then the bog landscape would be a border zone between those opposite communities. And over time, and that's something we can find back in the historical records, so let's say from especially late medieval time and early modern time, there's numerous cases of conflicts over bog use between different villages. And what we also see then is that there's agreements being made, often with higher powers intervening and saying, okay, we're going to draw a borderline here. We're going to draw, make a ditch or place border stones, etc. And that way, the border became ever more linear and would be somewhere in the middle of the bog then. So that's the idea. Well, if we look at a higher scale level, so you could say at that local scale level, that's our claim. We think that actually something close to environmental determinism may still have existed. But if you look at a regional scale, we don't think that idea is tenable. We can see in this map on the right-hand side, late medieval borders between regional entities, political entities in the present-day Netherlands. And we can see how that correlates or seems to correlate with the old expansions of peatlands. Of course, we cannot prove any causality there, but we seem to see some correlation. But what we also know is that, let's say, dukes or counts, they had, of course, a much bigger playing field. So they were not. It was definitely not so that a bog had to be a borderland between, for example, Brabant or Gelders or Drenthe. But it seems to us that there was some kind of logic in this very open wetland, non-forested wetland, more or less difficult to cross. There was a logic for those landscapes to function as borderlands. And that's, we claim, why so many of them have this tradition of being a borderland. Also, when one political entity changed into another one, the border would be conserved. Okay, turning to the third theme of human perceptions of bogs, mainly in past. Let me first define the concept of place meaning that we used in this third theme. So place meaning is a loose concept or a broad concept describing the different ways in which people can relate to a place or to a landscape. And that can be individually, but I would say it can also be as a group. And this can have various dimensions. Of course, there can be economical link, there can be aesthetics, you enjoy being in a place, or you grew up there as a kid, so you have emotional attachment, etc. Importantly, they are subjective by nature. They're not a given, objectively given thing. Place meanings are products of the human mind, you could say. And also, as culture might change over time and over space, so do place meanings. So that's the basic idea behind this bit of research that we did. And one starting point there was the very persistent negative stereotype of bogs that we see, not only in literature and in fiction, films, but also, for example, in many popular scientific works, even about larger Dutch box areas. So you readily find those stereotypes. They seem to be very persistent. So we were wondering, how can we explain this when we know that those bogs were economically so important and they were not avoided at all? So how can this coexist? So what we wanted to know was how did these long-term patterns in bog place meanings evolve over space and time? So in the historical and archaeological part, we focused on two big bog areas in the Netherlands. So one being up north, the Bourtangermoor region, and one in the south, the Pale region. And we also had a present day component, but I think Maria de Wit will explain more about that in the next session. That was a present day online survey where we also asked questions to find out what people's place meanings of bog regions were right now. And we focused there on 6 smaller bog areas, 3 of which were actually included in those larger regions that we studied historically. So just to give you a very quick idea, I'm not going to go in detail about at least the historical written sources that I used for my bit of that research. So you can see it starts somewhere in late medieval time, relatively few sources then, and sources become more abundant as we approach the present. So this is just a graph to show you the overall results of that taken together. So we had 3 components. We had an archaeological component that Roy van Beek and Flo Huisman worked on. We had the historical part. Those are actually the green bars that you see. So the dark green bars are those for the Bourtangermoor area, and the light green bars are those for the Peel area. And then we had the small orange dots, but again, that will be probably in Maria's presentation next time, about the present day situation. And on the left, you can see 8 place meaning dimensions that we predefined based on the literature and on expert judgment, specifically for bog landscapes. And we were looking with different approaches for the 3 disciplines that we used, which of these place meanings we could find back in our sources and what the context of that was. So what we see immediately is that many of those, so let's say all 8 of those dimensions were found for the present day and also for the historical part, but most of those were only found from about 1850 onwards, so in the late modern period. Think of biodiversity, beauty, attachment. And I must say that biodiversity, we're not looking for the term biodiversity as such, because we know that's a very recent technical term, but anything that came close to biodiversity as that concept, we coded. And we only found that in those relatively recent historical sources. The 2 dimensions that were stretching back further in time were functionality and risk. And that matches very well with the archaeological record, and also there we have an additional one, the mystery part, which we also see reoccurring in historical sources. So something about this coexistence of contrasting place meanings, because we were particularly interested in building a narrative how that could be. So for example, you had this functionality, bogs were used, they were needed by local communities, but people also saw them as risky places or places of fear almost. And one thing we found in relatively recent oral history narratives, which were sometimes very detailed, was that people used to be working hard, and they were not regulating working weeks, so people would be out also at nighttime if needed. And then they were in this bog landscape. And then the physical bog landscape comes into play. It's openness, and we know from environmental psychological research that a very open landscape is, giving kind of an uneasy feeling to people because it's difficult to orient. May also be a soggy area. You might not have stable ground everywhere. And then you have this natural light phenomena that people actually reported also in those oral history records. To give you a few quotes. Did you ever experience when we were walking here in Valtermond and looking over the dike that there were lights coming on? What was that? These were will-o'-the-wisps. That is one fragment of such a dialect recording. Another one is, they used to see all sort of things and nowadays they see nothing. But that was because people were always in the field, in nature, even at night. They did not look at whether it was dark or light. And I need to say here that het veld, the field, is actually in Drenthe, rather heathland or bogland than arable land. Okay, so diving a bit more into this contrast between place meanings. We also had this idea of insider versus outsider. We know that bogs have been places of refuge, not only in the Netherlands, but in many places. We know studies from Estonia, from Britain, talking, for example, about hiding places during wartime, hiding places for smugglers, etc. And typically those were people that were familiar with that bog landscapes, to a degree even where we found a very nice quote example of those landscapes being used by insiders to intimidate authorities or outsiders. When the Reverend de Weert confronted peat workers of the Scholten firm who drank a lot and thus left little money for their families, he would receive notes at home telling him to come at midnight to this or that boardwalk, to this or that peat pit. And he would go there with a lantern. He would go there and he would hear people talking, but he would leave him alone. They wanted to see whether he dared to come. So I'm running through this quickly. I hope it's not too quick. I will now switch to the fourth theme that we're working on. And I must say this is work in progress. We've actually just begun working on it. So it's some first ideas. It's about cultural remains at the surface of bog landscape. I stress the surface of bog landscape because we know from the previous sessions, which were more archaeology, that of course, think of bog bodies or other precious finds that were done deeper in the bog. We're talking now about more recent times, so traces that you can find at the surface. So it's important to know that ever since, let's say, the Second World War, at least, all bogs that remain in the Netherlands are now highly protected nature reserves. And there's an important task for ecological restoration of those bogs because they have been degraded by drainage, for example, but also by atmospheric nitrogen inputs. And that ecological restoration is actually pretty successful, but it also requires that action is being undertaken around the bog. And one thing that struck us also was that, of course, we have all kinds of cultural remains in those bogs, but they are pretty underexposed when you compare it to the ecological task and ecological goal, which is maybe not strange if you realize that it's nature conservance agencies that manage those areas. And interestingly, there's a lot of contestation going on, I think, in different bog areas in the Netherlands, surely in the Pale area in the southeast. Because as I said, there are large programs to revitalize, to restore those raised bogs. But things need to be done also surrounding those nature reserves. Farmers need to leave their land, land needs to be re-wetted, etc. And that is actually leading to some kind of resistance also in local communities. And interestingly, we found this recent news item showing that actually the cultural traces, the cultural history part is brought in as an argument there by locals. So I think there's a number of challenges for those nature reserves. So one is to bring more balance into the natural and cultural values of bogs in the management. And the second is how to engage with local residents for successful management in the end of your area. So, well, that's the question. One thing that could be done, I think, is to make cultural remains that are at the surface of the landscape even more visible and experienceable than they are right now. And I must be honest there, I know many nature conservancy agencies are already doing that, are already placing signs or QR codes and explaining what people can see there. And here's a photo and a map that one of our master students, Jeroen Wanders, produced. On the right-hand side, you see a map of a peat bog in the Achterhoek in the eastern Netherlands, where you can see, if you look in the square A, you can see those parallel dikes running into the bog, and each dike would have its own name, probably named after the owner who went there for cutting peat. So it's not only material heritage or remains, but also immaterial, the names, the place names, the field names. And you can also see in two locations, Villa Duikelaar and the Jewish hiding place, that those bogs also played a role in the Second World War for people to hide. And actually, at Villa Duikelaar, I know that the remains are still present in the field. So one additional thing that could be done is maybe accommodate people's own histories, the residents surrounding those bogs, bring in their stories, let them connect their stories to the area much more explicitly. And finally, an idea that I find intriguing myself, if we can restore bog activity, peat growing activity, then in the end, the bog starts to work as a conservator itself again. So, and eventually traces might be buried under the peat, but conserved that way. And even then, vegetation differences might be visible for decades, accentuating where certain traces were. So let me briefly conclude this, try to wrap it up in a few conclusions. So we've seen that bog landscapes were by no means economically marginal. We've also seen, and that's important for commons theory beyond this bog-related research, that long-term use of common pool resources can actually go together with moderate degrees of commercialization. We've seen that different place meanings, seemingly contrasting place meanings of bogs could coexist over time. For example, using bogs economically, but also a certain risk or fear of the bog. And we've explained that through the very specific characteristics of bog landscapes and their affordances. As rival not only for those meanings, but also, for example, for bordering processes that occurred in the bog. And finally, we've pointed at the imbalance that we think is there between the natural and cultural values of bog landscapes. And we're wondering if it would be possible to highlight cultural values to reduce possibly tensions around bog restoration projects. So I'd like to leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions if there's still time.
Thanks a lot, Maurice. That was a very interesting presentation with many aspects. And so if you have questions for Maurice, please unmute yourself and post a question or put them in the chat. Yeah, maybe I can start with a question for you. It was very interesting about this three different situations of the market dominating peatlands or communal management of peatlands and state-owned land. And what is the lesson that we can draw from that for the future? So if you have an area which thinks about this, and what lessons could we learn from that?
That's a great question. I know that there's a lot of thinking going on also by historians, but also by other practitioners about re-establishing commons for land and research management in the Netherlands. And maybe relating to the last theme that I discussed, that is this tension between cultural and natural values of people and how to engage surrounding communities that are sometimes fiercely opposed to rewetting measures. Well, it could be an idea maybe to go in the direction of a common, where these people actually have the right to influence management or to co-decide on management of that area. Maybe that's a way to also bring in their needs and their interests and their worries for the area.
Yeah, because they're directly affected.
So it would have to replace, let's say, the classical state-run nature conservancy, or not state-run or private nature conservancy, but it could be more of a cooperation than it is now, perhaps.
Yeah.
Step one.
Yeah.
There's a question from Kate.
Okay, yes, Kate has a question. I will read it to you. I wonder what cultural interpretations of peatlands, Maurice or others, might point us to as successfully drawing attention to hoogveen in Dutch landscapes. There must be many. What cultural interpretations of peatlands might point us to as successfully drawing attention to hoogveen in Dutch landscapes?
So, Kate, I guess that's you.
You understand the question?
Yeah. Now I was wondering what the question exactly was. So are you looking for key traces or remains that might be most powerful in engaging, or I'm not sure I understand the question correctly.
Kate, can
just,
you?
My apologies for an unclear question. I was thinking about, for newcomers, what is already working to make people excited, and then if you wanted to say what you would like to draw attention to, that's great.
Okay, I thank you, Kate, for clarifying. I'm sorry for I'm not sure. I think it also depends where people come from, where newcomers come from. I guess I can imagine if they come from very different places, that the whole idea of a wetland as a raised bog might be already intriguing to them. I would say if people come here and they're interested in the landscape, take them to such kind of last stretches of wilderness that we have, such as raised bogs or raised bogs to be restored, and let them talk about and reflect also on their own landscape where they originally come from, because there's no way, I think, to predict what might excite them or not at all. But it would be very interesting also for people to share maybe their home landscapes and reflect on what they recognize or what they find intriguing. Yeah.
Good, thanks for that question, Kate. There's another question from Alex Yalu. How can making people aware of historic peatland interactions aid them to change their perceptions of the peatlands and of future adaptations or management which are needed to tackle climate change?
Okay.
So,
yeah. Well, I think one thing, if there are any people left that are really afraid of bogs or think these lands are worthless or wastelands that should be cultivated, if these people still exist, then I think this history can show that how intimate relations were, economical and cultural relations were between humans and bogs in this part of the world. So, well, one thing would be that there has been a close interaction. It might also be the message that what I sense, let's say, in the tradition of nature reserve and maybe also the tradition of climate change debate, is that humans are bad. You know, humans are the root of evil. They have destroyed wilderness, they have destroyed nature, and now they're destroying the climate, which is true in a way. But I think historical research is per definition about people, and landscape history is about people's relation with the land. So you always have to bring in people. You cannot erase them from the story. So maybe it's a way to show that, okay, we can also be part of the solution. We're not only the evil guys, but, you know, if one thing, then that way of thinking might help.
good, thank you, Mike. There's another question from my friend from Bangladesh, Jalan Udin Schwab. I'm glad that you joined us today from over there. And Jalal Udin asks, may I know what types of vegetation were there and what is the age of it? And I'm assuming that he's talking about the peat.
Okay, yeah. Well, the age is for me a little bit difficult to say, but well, vegetation types, they are relatively acidic, not very species-rich vegetations, I would say, but they have very typical species, of course, because they are restricted to such nutrient-poor and acidic environments. So sphagnum moss, of course, which I think also occurs in many tropical countries, is one of the species groups. It's an important peat builders, and then you would have a lot of heather-like, Ericacea-like shrubs growing on the bog surface, giving it a kind of a heathland appearance, along with some grasses, etc., and some flowering plants. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. One thing that you mentioned is very interesting, that this borderland, which is very interesting, and you see that in different landscapes with contrasting conditions, that there's always activities adapted to it, and is biodiversity also enhanced because of because of the contrasting between the different landscapes?
Okay, but you mean borderlands as in political borders?
No, the borderlands as landscape units, with this contrasting between the wetland and the land bordering it.
Yeah.
Or is that beyond the scope of your?
Your question is if it brings in additional biodiversity,
exactly, yeah,
as gradients.
Yeah.
It's not really a focus of my work, because that would be more ecology, I think. Of course, there are the so-called lag zones where raised bogs go in a gradient to mineral soils, and they have, I think sometimes they have car forest-like, almost forest type of vegetation. So yes, they have their own peculiar vegetation types as well. And I guess it becomes a little bit more species rich there because it becomes less acid and less nutrient poor. Yeah.
Good. Well, I think we're almost done with time. One last final question that sparked my interest was the dwaallichten. So the lights that people saw at night in times when they would also traverse these landscapes. Was that ever explained?
Yeah, well, that's one thing that is on my task list, because I'm originally a scientist and I still feel a little bit uncomfortable with it. But what I found so far is that apparently it really existed. There are chemoluminescence also bioluminescence, think of glimwormen, the English word. So these phenomena apparently could occur in this type of wetland. You also have to remember that those were vast areas, even in Drenthe, where just beside the large peat exploitation, there would still be big tracts of undisturbed bogs waiting to be cut away. And there was no electric light before the 1920s. So it really got dark, you know. Yeah. So I can imagine that people saw these kind of even faint phenomena and were afraid of it.
Yes.
So it seems to be a natural cause.
Yeah. Good. Okay, thanks a lot, Maurice. And we'll break for 5 minutes now, and after that we'll go to the next presentation. So see you back in 5 minutes. So welcome back. We proceed after the presentation of Maurice. We now proceed with a presentation from Dr. Abbi Flint. She is a research associate of the School of History, Classics and Archeology of Newcastle University, and Abbi will talk, the title of her talk is Saturated with Meanings, Exploring Cultural Perceptions of Peatlands Through Research and Poetry. So the floor is yours, Abbi.
Thanks very much, and I'll just try and share my screen. See my slides in a moment. I'll just get to the start. There we go. Hopefully you can see my slides clearly now. So good afternoon, everybody. And it's a real pleasure to be here as part of these Peatland Exchange events. I'm very grateful for the invitation to share some of the work I did in 2020 to 21 as part of the Wet Futures project. And that was exploring how people perceive wetland heritage. So I'm going to talk about some aspects of the research findings today, and also share some of the research poetry that I wrote in response to that. So it's a mixture of research and poems that we'll be having. So to say a little bit about the Wet Futures project, Wetland Futures in Contested Environments was an international project which explored inter and transdisciplinary approaches to wetland heritage in the Netherlands, Ireland, and UK. I was part of the UK team led by Dr. Ben Jennings at the University of Bradford. And in the UK, we had 3 study sites, 2 lowland peatlands, Shapwick Heath in the Somerset Levels and Thorn and Hatfield Moor in the Humberhead peatlands, and also an upland peatland site called Ilkley Moor. And it's Ilkley Moor that I'm going to talk about in the majority of the session today. This is where I did the most of the research that I did was conducted around Ilkley Moor, and it's the landscape you can also see behind me in this picture. I'm not obviously sat there today, but I thought it was a lot more interesting than the background of my office. So it's an upland peatland in West Yorkshire in the UK with areas of blanket bog, and it's also an internationally important site for prehistoric rock art and other lithic monuments. It's been influenced by humans since prehistory, from Neolithic and Bronze Age clearance and occupation, historical mining and quarrying, and more recent management for grazing animals, grouse shooting and recreational use. So I'm going to start with a poem that I wrote as a creative response to an article Ben Jennings and I authored on the role of heritage and folklore in the way that people engage with peatlands. I'm going to play this now. It's accompanied by a video and some photographs of the moor taken by Ben, which I hope will give you a flavour of this landscape before I start to talk about it and the research findings. Saturated with stories. Peatlands blur water and earth, a shape-shifting land where past and present collapse, where nature and culture entangle. If we listen, what story will they tell? This story begins before words, with trees, cleared by people, by climate, to form peat. This story begins with absence from maps, wastelands to be tamed and drained into use, damage that outlasts generations. This story begins with homes on a mire, haunted and dangerous, wild tales of moors as ancient and alien. It's a story of other than human, of black moor dogs
of bottomless depths of will-o'-the-wisps, fairies that dwell in watery places, where bodies are not lost, but intentionally interred in liminal spaces. This story begins with people, of living and working, burying and remembering, healing, forgetting, walking, to escape. This story is unspoken, needs science to translate what was quietly written in archives of pollen and fragments. This is a story of wilderness managed for water, for carbon, for nature, as a resource for our future. This is a story of balance. On Ilkley Moor, a peaty palimpsest from Neolithic to today, written in traces of settlements and standing stones, rocks carved and circled for reasons unknown, where a giant's wife spilled skirtfuls of stones, giving way to big cats and UFOs, metropolis of hydros, the mountain spa, where a song warns of going out bar tat, and where Darwin came for the water cure. Today, stanza stones are etched with poetry, and ancient paths trace crash sites through sheepfolds to quarries where land was made to work, where commoners hold rights to graze and walk. These stories re-enchant peatlands, stories that are still being written, an unbroken dialogue with more than one voice. Widening the lens changes our view of peatlands as plural, old and new. What future tales will tell of crashed bikes, of curlew, of poetry, of re-wetted bogs? Shared stories make space for shared ownership, where we all play our part in the telling and co-create new kinds of heritage. Peatlands are saturated with stories.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little visual tour of Ilkley Moor that my colleague at the University of Bradford, where this work was conducted, Ben Jennings, took those videos and pictures and put that together for us. So just get on to the next slide.
We're cleared by people, by
it seems to want to play the video again rather than
climate.
move slide. There we go. So I was with the Wet Futures project for just over a year, and my focus was conducting multi-method qualitative research into how peatlands and their heritage were perceived and represented. So the research was conducted during periods of COVID-19 lockdown. So the initial approach we'd planned of doing walking interviews with people in the landscape was posed quite immediate practical and ethical challenges. So we moved to a completely online method. So I drew on 4 different perspectives in thinking about how wetlands were perceived. One was looking at scholarly perspectives from the academic and grey literature. Another was looking at professional perspectives, looking at policy around peatlands, and also 3 interviews with experts who had a national role in either peatlands or cultural heritage. Then I looked at public perspectives, and I was lucky enough that the 3 sites we were looking at are all destinations for tourism as well. So all of them had reviews on TripAdvisor. So I was able to look at how people were describing these sites as a tourist destination. And I also looked at how these sites were represented in newspaper coverage over the last 10 years. And the 4th strand, which is what I'm going to talk about most today, was how local people felt about these peatlands. So the people who lived near them or had an active interest in them. So I conducted an online survey of 2 of the sites, Thorn and Hatfield Moor and Ilkley Moor, and 8 in-depth interviews with people local to Ilkley Moor. These interviews used an approach called photo elicitation. So that was basically me asking the participants to bring 3 images that said something of what the moor meant to them and talk about those images as part of the interview, which was a way of getting around the fact that we couldn't actually be in the landscape together. The interviews were recorded and transcribed, and along with the regular qualitative thematic analysis, I also used an approach called poetic transcription. So poetic transcription uses the words of an interview to create a kind of found poem. So it involves selecting keywords and phrases from the interview to create a poem out of the participant's voice. So my process was to read and reread the interview transcripts and then highlight key phrases that spoke to some of the research themes or stood out as a really powerful way of the participants' feelings about the moor being expressed. I then cut these phrases out, as you can see in this lovely image, and then moved them around. So although I didn't change any of the participants' words and I didn't add any of my own words, they aren't necessarily in the order that they appeared in the interview, the phrases. But it was really important for me that those should stay in the voice of the research participants and stay in their phrasing to keep that alive. And the result was a series of poems which speak to local perspectives of Ilkley Moor and pick up on some of the research themes around things like emotional connection to the landscape, their sense of identity and sense of place. And I especially focused on where the cultural and natural heritage of the peatlands played a role in this. So one of the reasons that I chose this approach is that I write poetry outside of work, so it was something that really interested me in bringing into my research. But I also like the way that a poem can hold some of those plural meanings of landscapes and plural voices of landscapes in a single form. And I like the way that it allowed me to keep the voices of the participants alive in the research in a way that I didn't think a couple of disembodied quotes might let me. And we hoped that perhaps some people might read the poems who wouldn't be as interested in reading a research article. So it was another way of getting the research out. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the themes in the way that Ilkley Moor has been perceived, drawing from across those 4 research strands that I talked about. And I see the cultural representations of Ilkley Moor as very much part of its cultural heritage. Cultural heritage isn't just about the physical remains like the archaeology and modern monuments. It's about intangible heritage, traditions, practices, folklore, and how the moor's been seen over time. I'm going to pick up on 4 of those themes, which, as Maurice picked up in his presentation as well, some of these ways of representing peatlands can actually be seen in contestation or in conflict with one another. So I picked 4 of these that I think represent some of the tensions around the way that moors are perceived, peatlands are perceived: danger and health, and recreation and nature. So peatlands are often associated with folklore that has a supernatural and dangerous element, will-o'-the-wisps that lure unwary travellers to their doom, and a whole cast of boggarts, witches, goblins, fairies and blackamoor dogs. And Ilkley Moor has its share of this kind of heritage. There are stories of fairies associated with a spring and a quarry. Other stories suggest the moor was used historically as a meeting place for witches. And more recently, there's contemporary folklore which tells of mysterious lights in the sky, and alien big cat sightings were mentioned by interview participants and have been covered in the newspapers that I looked at. And these align with that idea of peatlands as liminal places where other than human beings might be encountered and petitioned, and contribute to the feeling of this landscape as wild and potentially dangerous. However, as we can see by the quote on the screen, and from looking at the historical sources, from the mid-19th century, running alongside this idea of peatlands as dangerous or depressing, we get a sense of peatlands as a place for health and well-being. In the 19th century, Ilkley became a destination for healing as a spa resort with numerous hydrotherapy houses where the local waters were taken as part of treatments. And the moor itself was part of this therapeutic landscape, through the uplifting views from the hydrotherapy houses to walks on the moor as part of the treatment and the perceived benefits of the fresh upland air. And when I started looking at the sort of contemporary feelings about peatlands landscapes, it connects with some modern day conversations that we have about the benefit of spending time in nature for physical and mental well-being. Something mentioned across the research data was the physical and mental well-being benefits of visiting peatlands. Well-being was the second most common reason people gave for spending time on Ilkley Moor in our questionnaire. And in comments, people spoke of associating things like tranquility, reflection, relaxation, a sense of space and freedom with being on Ilkley Moor. The moor also has a long history as a recreational landscape. It was a popular destination for Victorian and Edwardian walkers who made a pleasure garden of the lower slopes of the moor. And it's currently managed for recreational use as an urban common. So people walk, run, rock climb, mountain bike, or use the moor as a general destination for family days out. And over 90% of the respondents to our Ilkley Moor questionnaire said that they use the moor for walking. So it's a very popular place to visit for recreational reasons. Some of these recreational activities leave physical traces in the landscape that become part of its heritage, like the paths and bridges and stiles and older structures like 19th century boundary markers and milestone markers. And more recently, peatlands have become a focus for nature and conservation. So in interviews and questionnaire comments, people mentioned local projects related to re-wetting the bogs and greater appreciation of the ecological role that peatlands play in biodiversity and carbon capture. And there's a tension between these in the present day where people spoke about their concerns about potential recreational overuse and how to protect the peatland environment. So I'm going to read one of the poetic transcriptions now that speaks to this theme in the research, where this particular participant spoke about their personal connection with the ecology of the moor and how the way that the moor was used and the impact of humans on it had an emotional impact on them. I feel very much part of the moorland landscape. The way it behaves, seasons affect me. I share its vulnerability. Mother Nature does what Mother Nature wants. We have to accept that. The autumn mist, the snow, we get proper winters up here. A beautiful place, but not all respect it. Seeing what humans do to the environment, sometimes I have to switch off. It's a lot of things to a lot of people. What some believe to be a natural environment is actually far from it. Sphagnum moss, a plant important for the health of wetland, for carbon, as flood control. If we drain the moor, we lose that benefit. Do you take your hands off the steering wheel? Let Mother Nature take complete control. Or do you have a hand on the tiller? We are fumbling our way through. So I think it's important to remember that peatlands are living landscapes with living cultural heritage that's evolving and being added to all the time. These changing and sometimes contested perceptions of the moor as a place of danger, health, recreation, and nature today, as in the past, reflect varied cultural uses of this landscape. And at Ilkley Moor, we can see continuities in the usage of time from recreational uses like walking as a working landscape, a place of well-being, and a place for social and family traditions like picking bilberries together. Those kind of traditions remind us that people's use of the landscape isn't just physical, it has an emotional and social significance too, as a place where people spend time together, as a landscape of memories. And some uses speak to a continued sense of the landscape as having a ritual and commemorative importance too, which connects with its cultural history. For example, in the present day, people scatter ashes, there's an air crash memorial that dates to the Second World War, and there are memorial benches for individuals, all echoing the possible past prehistoric importance of the landscape for remembering and connecting with the dead. And this sense of continued human presence of the peatland, going back into prehistory, was for some people something which added to their enjoyment of the landscape and what it meant to them. So I'm just going to read another poetic transcription now, which speaks to that theme. Footsteps. When you get onto the moors, there's a feeling of history. that you're treading in the footsteps of people from hundreds of thousands of years ago. The idea that land hasn't changed does make it a bit special. You might come across a rock and see these ancient marks, cup and ring marks, concentric circles, 3,500 years old. I just find that really magical. We've no idea what it means, why it was done. That idea of somebody being there and doing that, where you can just stand and see it, it just makes your spine tingle. And the picture that goes with this poem was one provided by the research participant of one of the rock art panels that they particularly enjoyed on Ilkley Moor. So I think what that poem also speaks to is the historical and archaeological time depth of peatland cultural heritage. But of course, this is only one of the senses of time that people encounter in peatlands. The anthropologist Barbara Bender writes about landscapes as time materializing, that different senses of time, the geological, the archaeological, the seasonal, and our human lifetime are experienced alongside one another when we spend time in landscapes. Similarly, the archaeologist Christina Fredengens talked about how the well-preserved remains within peat collapse the past and present when we encounter them in profound ways. Whilst there's not this traditional well-preserved peatland archaeology on Ilkley Moor, the cultural heritage did give it, in the words of our participants, an atmosphere of deep history and mythology, an ancient landscape that still pulses with the rhythms of the past. And these very different senses of time rubbing up against each other also came through in some of the interviews. So I'm going to read another poem now which speaks to that, in which the participants' words relate to the changing nature of the peatland landscape over daily and seasonal cycles, the lifespan of animals, and the intergenerational time of family. Forever changing. Along with the walking, you get the other things: birds, butterflies, dragonflies, frogs and toads, the little tarns, the changing seasons, weather conditions, how it's different every day. Last spring, when the weather was so beautiful, these green hair-streaked butterfly, metallic green, by the end of June, they were gone. Cotton grass is so magic, white balls moving back and to in the wind like a sea. Different heathers look stunning in July, the bog asphodel, picking bilberries, passing on the love of the moor to the grandkids. Last autumn, the whole moor looked golden, so golden as you looked over the moor, and then you get misty days when you can't see anything. It's quite grey and dark in the winter, bleak and desolate, and then so beautiful with the white snow. It's that changing, the changing seasons, the mist, the sunshine, or the time of year. It's just forever changing. And again, this is an image that the participant shared with me of cotton grass that she'd found so magical in that landscape. And I think what that poem also speaks to is the wonder and joy that encountering the natural heritage of peatlands brought for that participant. And this is something that came through in a number of other interviews and other strands of the research. There seems to be a tendency for the natural heritage of peatlands to evoke emotional engagement with these landscapes. Often people react with awe and wonder at the beauty of nature, as in the last poem, talking about that magical cotton grass, the seasonal plants, or even just the different weather conditions. And in contrast, the cultural heritage was much more likely to prompt an intellectual and imaginative response, so a cognitive engagement with the landscape. Encounters with the archaeology often sparked people's curiosity. And some people described using the prehistoric monuments as waymarkers or destinations for walks. They actively sought out aspects of the past cultural history, like the carved rocks or an overgrown golf course that was used on the moor until the early 20th century, to add interest and purpose to the time that they spent in the landscape. There's also a sense of pride and pleasure for people about sharing their knowledge of peatlands and its cultural heritage with others. As one put it, showing the visitors to their landscape the peatland heritage was sharing a bit of our culture with them. Along with this is a sense of the role that heritage plays in people's sense of place and identity in relation to peatlands. So a number of the questionnaire comments and the way people talked about them more in interviews indicated that they have a strong personal attachment. It was part of a landscape that they considered home and which contributed to their sense of self. One interview said, "I belong to it and it belongs to me." Others said, "I feel it is part of me, part of my being." So I'm going to close with an excerpt from a final poem, which illustrates the role that cultural history of the moor plays in identity. And this poem is created from an interview with someone who'd lived very close to Ilkley Moor all of their life and also had a semi-professional interest in its local history. But what came through for me was how the peatland and its heritage are also very important for their own life history and identity. The continuation of history. It lifts my heart when I look to the hills, sparks my interest when I start digging into it. How the moor has been a background for the lives of other people. I mean, we've got history. You just walk out onto the moor and you hit the history. Mesolithic, Neolithic, Romans, Knights Templars, Normans, you name it, we've got it. Victorians used it on high days and holidays. Then across the moor are tracks with Viking names. So much of it is still unknown, or if it was known, it's been forgotten. I see myself as playing a part, a small part, reviving those stories, reviving the memories, helping people understand where they live, look after it, create meaning. My first house I lived in with my husband, where my son was born, my first grandchild was born. Every event, I've got the moor as the backdrop. Do you see how it's always been there? Ilkley Moor is the background to my life, and my life is a continuation of history. So thank you for the chance to share this mix of research and poetry about an upland peatland landscape in the UK. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about the cultural history and the uses of the peatland landscape and how they're part of those sometimes conflicting ways in which the landscape is and has been represented. How cultural history is part of the multiple temporalities of peatlands and the role that it plays in the way that individuals draw meaning from peatlands and how that connects with their sense of self and place. On this slide, I've just put a couple of the articles that Ben and I have already had published about this research. There's more underway, and also links to further information about the Wet Futures project, as well as the references I mentioned in my talk. And very happy to take comments and questions, and also really interested to hear whether you think that using creative approaches like poetry is useful for communicating the value and meaning of peatlands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abbi. That was very enlightening and very interesting. And yeah, there's so many things that resonate with me from your presentation. Stories begin before words, before maps, and still being written. And shared stories make shared ownership. Yeah, and scientific poems as a carrier of scientific information. Maybe I start with a question first to you. Is you mentioned living landscape, living heritage, landscapes as living heritage, landscape of memories, and so kind of also an archive for stories. Could you say that that's not true for all types of landscape, not just for wetlands or peatlands?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it is true for all kinds of landscapes where people have interacted with them, and especially in the UK, where we don't have many landscapes that don't have any influence of cultural use over time. But I think there is sometimes a perception that people have that peatlands are much wilder and untouched by culture than they are. So I think certainly that poem that I read about Mother Nature, where there are, that person themselves said that they had thought that this was a really wild landscape until they'd learnt about it. So they'd learnt about how the landscape has been managed in the past. So I think highlighting the living cultural heritage of peatlands can help us sort of showcase how it's been affected by cultures in the past as well as in the present.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. There were a few questions in the chat, also comments mentioning that it was a very touching presentation, and other positive comments. There was a question from Emily who says, "How do you publish and share the poems created through poetic transcription?"
Oh, so that's something we're working on. Thanks for that question, Emily. So yeah, I'm still working on some of the poems. Obviously we got permission from the participants to use their voices in this way, because it's very different than perhaps just using a short quote in a research article. So I sent the poems back to the participants to make sure they were happy with them, the way that I've used their voice, and to share them in the images. So one of the ways that Ben and I are hoping to share them is to create a short pamphlet of the poems alongside some of the images that the participants shared, and publishing that and making that available. I'm also planning to put some excerpts from some of them in academic articles. I think poetic transcription has been used in a lot of other disciplines, so I don't think there's any reason that we shouldn't publish them as part of academic articles and see them as part of academic writing. And we're also sharing them through events like these. We've had them printed onto postcards and posters so that we can use them in face-to-face events as well. So really trying to get out there. But if you have any other suggestions of how they could be shared, that would be great.
Thanks a lot. And Alex had a question about what criteria did you use to find the 8 local people with which you conducted the interviews?
Well, thanks, Alex. Yeah, there's not a lot of time to talk about methodology because I wanted to share the poems and the voices of the participants. But so we conducted an online survey for Ilkley Moor, and as part of that, we asked people if they would like to take part in a more in-depth interview, and then selected the 8 local people who volunteered from that to kind of provide a range of ages and gender. So just to make sure we weren't just talking to one kind of person. So yeah, they were self-selecting in a way in that they put their names forward and then we selected from that list.
And Abbi, could you tell something about your own experience with people, how they perceive, let's say, how they perceive the poems, and then their perception of landscape? So obviously the poems are a way to connect people with the history of landscapes, but could you tell something about your own experience with that, how that functions? Because I'm sure it will have given you a specific experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, we're just starting to share the poems, so just starting to get feedback on them, but I think it's been generally positive. It's a different way of talking about the research, which I think people sometimes welcome. I think there's something about poems that can hold emotion, and I think that often connects with people. And I think for this landscape, for me, it seemed like a landscape that there was a natural poetic connection as well. So the poet Ted Hughes has a collection called Remains of Elmet that was written about the wider landscape of Ilkley Moor. The stanza stones that were mentioned in that film poem that I shared at the start, that's a Millennium Project that was ran across the Pennine landscape. And they got the now Poet Laureate Simon Armitage of England to create poems that were carved onto stone and then put in the landscape. So there's kind of a poetic connection with the landscape already. And I think somebody's already mentioned in the chat the wonderful bog poems of Seamus Heaney as well. So I think there's already a kind of poetic connection around bogs as well. So I think it lends itself well to the subject.
Yes, certainly. Kate mentioned, I think it's fantastic how you show how poetic transcription arises from the social research. Maybe there's something else about language. Perhaps poetry is especially able to cope with ambiguity, shifting meanings.
Oh, thanks for raising that, Kate. Yeah, I totally agree. There's something about poetry as a form that people are willing to let it hold ambiguous meanings and plural meanings and perhaps conflicting meanings as well. So not as tied to a linear narrative, which I think really helps with peatlands where there's so many plural meanings of those landscapes, and some of them, as Maurice pointed out in his session as well, some of those potentially in conflict with each other or in contrast or tension with each other. And I think poetry is a way of holding those.
Thank you, Abby. And you had this slide where you connected peatlands with danger and health and the perceptions of people, and so and I think that was mentioned by Maurice as well. So the folklore perception of more as something dangerous. So what would that, from your idea, be connected to? So maybe that moors are were not well understood and maybe inaccessible or difficult. And accessible in danger in the sense of people could drown in them. What is the major underlying feeling that led to these beliefs or fears?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I'm not a folklorist, so I can't speak as the origin of some of the folklore around bogs, but certainly one of the aspects of the intangible heritage of Ilkley Moor is a song called On Ilkley Moor Batat, which some people may have heard of. It's kind of an unofficial Yorkshire anthem, but that itself is a story about the danger of the moorland landscape, because somebody goes out without their hat, improperly dressed for the landscape, and ends up dying and being eaten by worms and then eventually the ducks. So it's kind of a cautionary tale. So I think there's possibly something around that moorland, like this is an upland peatland, we're talking about Ilkley Moor, so it's quite an exposed landscape, upland landscape, so there's possibly danger there. But I think the point that Maurice made about outsider and insider perspectives as well, that some of the things that I came across when I was doing the literature review, some of the 19th century travel accounts were very obviously written by people from outside of this landscape, and they tended to describe it as depressing and desolate and isolated, and often extend those descriptions to the people who live near the landscape as well. And I wonder if we had accounts of the people who lived locally and used this landscape at the same time, whether they would be as negative about the peatlands. Certainly in some of the research, when I looked at the TripAdvisor reviews, people were very positive about these landscapes, you know. So yeah. I don't think they necessarily have that negative connotation anymore.
No, exactly. So that is also that perception changes over time and also between people. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Abby. Thanks a lot for your enlightening presentation.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, please hang around for the discussion at the end. And now I'd like to give the floor to our artist in residence, Kate, who will talk about traces and maps perceiving former peatscapes. And the floor is yours, Kate.
Hello. I want to thank Emily Toner, who's been making sure that all our slides happen on time and with great efficiency. So thank you, Emily. I'm Kate Foster. I'm an environmental artist. I've focused on peat since 2016. You'll probably have picked up that this is the third of a series of 4 Peatland Exchanges at the outset of my residency in the World Soil Museum. I wanted to mention that our last session was on the 24th of February, the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. It's a deep preoccupation for everyone, but spending time over the last fortnight on Abbi's and Maurice's work has really affirmed to me the importance of careful scholarship and the scholarship that goes about our perceptions and assumptions. So back to my Out Science residency, the overarching theme is valuing wetlands and their soils. This project of mine began in 2016 in Scotland as peat cultures and continued since 2020, working alongside the Home Turf and Wet Futures research with the initial help of an Erasmus Plus grant. This title slide shows my topics for the first 2 Peatland Exchange sessions. The first was sensing a peat bog in time, and the second was about lives lived, weaving above and below the surface. For these sessions, I've been making 2 sets of drawings. I'll show you a compost bag later in the talk, but right now I'll talk about the shadow puppet series I'm making. This is a recap coming from the last 2 sessions. They are a cast of characters, none of which are human. I'm scoping out the main non-human peatland stakeholders. Naturally, I had to begin with the peat bog, and here is one in response to the hydrological theme in Ochienota's talk. And in response to Cindy Quick's presentation on the peat archive, here's a new boggy symbol, an hourglass made of time indicators, both natural and cultural. In the second session, we focused on a selection of archaeological objects from the archives of the Drents Museum. And this was thanks to curator Floor Houseman. She showed a pre-Roman shoe in the bog. And at this point, I'm going to appeal to any home turf or wet futures researchers who can provide more precision to comments to just help me out in the chat because I can't quite remember what era the shoe was. There might be other occasions where you want to fill out my detail. But yes, here's a shoe. In response to Floor's display, I made a figure of a red shoe, and this merged ideas of sacrifice and accidental loss. But thinking up a figure for Roy van Beek's environmental archaeological research was a particular challenge. It had to be about the space between found objects. And this is a space that only persistent research can give shape to. So I chose a rather abstract idea: the depression of an oak wood chip from a peg that came from one of the Netherlands' greatest archaeological finds, the Barge Oosterweld Temple. So the shadows created by this puppet were particularly important. I think I wanted to give the idea of water flowing through the bodies of lives that have been lived. Creating shadows means that you have to decide which details to include and which to exclude. With the red shoe, I also thought about ecological footprint. The final session in 2 weeks' time is giving me a chance to review my shadow puppets. And if new narratives do develop, it will need to be as a collaborative effort. Reading Abbi and Maurice's work was a joy, affirming to me that the benefits of patient interdisciplinary research, testing out assumptions and reimagining futures. To move on to today's theme, which is perceiving former landscapes. I'm going to talk about arriving in the Netherlands. I had to learn to see traces of peat bogs and how looking at old maps helped do this. So I'll introduce new drawings with the themes remnants, mapping, and touring. And at the end of the talk, I'll give a flavour of what's happening in the project studio here in the museum. So to think first about remnants. Maurice's research tells us why this old map of the Pale, the peat bog in Brabant, is so interesting. He told me about it early in 2020 and gave me this image. It offers so many lines of inquiry. Let's think about mapping as something done with intention for a purpose, whether by contemporary artists or post-medieval scribes. Responding to Maurice, I thought of Cathy Prendergast, an Irish artist who, in this piece, someone described her, Catherine Harmon described her. Prendergast draws parallels between the exploration, conquest, and exploitation of virgin lands and that of the female body. COVID lockdown meant I continued to explore peaty landscapes from a makeshift home studio. The textbook, Hoogvenen, guided me in making remote connections to Dutch peat bogs. I focused in on figure 1, which I believe depicts where heather-covered remnant peat bogs lie, but perhaps one of the Dutch-speaking colleagues here could keep me right. Meantime, in 2020, many people were busy with gardening in the spring. Garden centres were ready to sell compost, most containing imported peat. Bear with me, there is a connection here. Artists work in curious ways. The drawing on the compost bag that I chose to show in this session is where I put all the Dutch remnant hoogvenen or raised bogs out as a map. These are the field sites of the Home Turf project, concentrating on these rather than the fenlands in the west. De Grote Pijl is one of Maurice's study areas. All of the places have intriguing names. But I needed to learn to understand what has happened here. Up to this point, I really had no idea how many Dutch landscape icons are connected to peatland recommendation. And these are the headlines that I learned from the book Hoogvenen. This is a start in my guide to Dutch peat cultural landscapes. I made quick drawings in response to a section in each book. If you want the references, I can find them. Give me a little time and I'll get back to you. Peat digging sites have existed since the Middle Ages. Windmills helped drain the low-lying fenlands. Peat was the first fossil fuel. People still bear in mind the labour of peat extraction. It was called brown gold. Whole landscapes disappeared as the peat was dug out. Canals were dug between the peat digging colonies and the big cities. In places, drained land sank because of peat extraction and because it dried out. At peat digging sites in some areas in the fenlands, characteristic lakes formed called plassen. Polders, or strips of agricultural land, appeared on the maps as long rectangles. So to move on to mapping. This image is a copy of a photograph. It's a copy I drew from a photograph of a map from the 17th century, which was made to settle a dispute in northwest England. I'm using it as a motif for today's talk, and I copied it to avoid copyright concerns. This meant that I could study the marks. You think a lot when you're drawing, and so I made notes on the edge. It comes from Melanie Giles' book, and she referred to Shannon 2015, so I learned more about these maps. Far away from the bog in London, a law court was called to help settle a case between two new landowners. These were emerging as kinds of entrepreneur in the turbulence of the religious Reformation. So this early map is about claiming ground for individual wealth. I thought I could see modern cartography symbols emerging as I looked at the symbols in the copy on the map. Maurice's work, not so much developed in his really amazing comprehensive talk today, but also he refers to this pivotal moment. Peatlands on map has begun to be populated with symbols. So by looking at marks on the dispute map, this is my version of a classic rush, sedge, the symbol that's used on a map to map the wet ground. Working digitally means that I can replicate it and hint at perspective on this slide, give distance. But I also think this symbol speaks of summer growth that is visible in daytime. And what about night and what about winter? This brown dormant figure could denote the same hummock forming rush and grasses in winter or in nighttime. But what was the peat used for? Did its production produce wealth for some? How would people have been aware of peat in their daily life? From Maurice's paper, I learned that one use of peat from the pale was to make beer in the city of Bosch. I got that wrong. It's Hertog's Wood, so it's Bosch, I think. So here is the tankard, based on a Golden Age painting that came from 1634 by Willem Claes. The Dutch story of peat involves both memories of labour and hardship, as well as these wealthy echoes. Seen in bird's eye view, maps began to show characteristic folders. I explored this in this drawing. And in sessions 2 and also Maurice, Jeroen Wender's master's dissertation at Waar has been mentioned. For me, this map links themes from Maurice and Abbi's work. On the ground, you might not even see the extended low ridges, let alone think about what they were for. But studying the topography and the names tells you of lines of advance by different peat diggers. I think if you know this, and you can also see this kind of map, you start to have a sense of one era in the past in one place. So for Abbi's theme, I chose touring as a theme to encapsulate my responses. One of her many research methods was analysing responses to moorland visits on TripAdvisor. Her work adds a subtle understanding of what people perceive in a landscape and what shapes this. This makes me think that what I myself would now want in a tour. As a tourist, you can find yourself on an entertainment trail. So, moving from the commodification that was visible in early cartography, I moved towards ideas about how TripAdvisor affirms our role as consumers. So this is a shadow puppet, still in construction to be honest, of a logo for a wise advisor who's developing an owl form. This is a photo from my first tour of Dutch peatscapes. I was heading to the Drents Museum with Roy in January 2020. Lottie Matthew's master's dissertation helped me learn about the previous lay of the land from the place names. Veen is peat, and Hoogveen would mean high peat, and Heerenveen, I believe, would mean gentleman's peat. But why might you go on a peat tour? You might also go west to the UNESCO cultural landscape of the Beemster, where windmills pump the reclaimed ground, Fen and peat. Or find these typical veen colony towns in Drenthe from the era of large-scale reclamation of the raised bogs. Or you might go back in time and wonder where the prehistoric trackways were. A keen eye would see evidence of desiccating ground, which in this celebrated instance dramatically revealed foundations. This is a profile of a floor from a farmhouse of the Middle Iron Age. You couldn't see this by looking, but the excavation showed layers that, to me, spoke of the effort of keeping the ground under your feet dry, as manure, reeds and rush alternating with refuse. So this is my last section. What's going on in the project studio? This is a sketch for an installation, and it's coming to pass. There's a corner in the World Soil Museum with a studio feel. I can work here once a week on Wednesday afternoons. You're welcome to visit. You can read about it in a new blog post. I meant to put it in the chat, but you can find it on my website. There's two sections, a studio side and an inspiration side. I'm setting out inspirations of other people's works and ideas. This is the current display on the project studio side. But there's quite a lot going on in the inspiration section. Look carefully and you can see Bert Hoekstra's wire sculpture of annoying insects. I have to bring them out in person. Bert Hoekstra is an artist who's taken to wire sculptures, and these are hand animated midges or mosquitoes. And since we have so much peat now in the museum, I felt that they had to have a present. I'm really not sure if you can see anything. I shall have to try and draw them out for you. They're very annoying. Oops, I held it upside down. I beg your pardon. And also, Roy van Beek has a collection of turf stakers, and three of these have appeared on the wall. And these made Stephan Mantel recall this classic from the 1930s, written in an Old Dutch that to me is fairly inaccessible. But on the inspiration side, I want to end with this reflection on this compost bag. It was found recently by a landscape gardener in the Wageningen area. It dates from the era not so long ago when peat extraction stopped in the Netherlands. I find it a sad thing. I try to understand that it takes a generation to realize that plastic does not decompose and that using peat-based compost is very environmentally damaging. So I set this beside a poem by David Borthwick, an environmental scholar at the University of Glasgow. He set it out on a 2020 diary page, an era that was emptied by lockdown. So we prepared a response to fill this era with generative ideas last November in a workshop called Earthwords. David wrote 3 new poems for this. And this is one that fits, I think, for me, with the find of the compost bag. What can one do with the knowledge that common objects gathered here at home in this place with familiar hills, rivers and sea are made from other landscapes, that homely things have been extracted? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate, for your reflections and inspirations on, and also relating to the previous talks. Yeah, I particularly like your shadow play as a kind of visual poetry and also a way to reflect on the landscapes. Wonderful, also visible here in the museum. Yeah, we can ask questions to both Abby, Maurice, and Kate, and let's see if there are questions in the chat. Yeah, one thing also to mention, Kate mentioned as well, that there is a blog online, so you can go there, read it. It's in the chat. Emily asked, will there be a puppet show at the end of the series? It would be interesting to form a stories that ties them all together. And shadow play, you know that of course is a very old tradition. That is also a way to communicate norms, guidelines, stories, all kind of things in different societies. But anyway, Emily's question was if there will be a puppet show or a shadow play show.
That would be a great thing to make together. Next week I will be pulling it together, and next session I will be pulling together something about the shadow puppets, and I don't know yet what I'll say. There is a growing collection and they're getting larger, which is worrying because I do have one idea that they might fit onto a bicycle and I might take them between here and Scotland, and I can't pretend that I'm going to cycle all the way. But yes, I might cycle around a village or even Amsterdam on the way. Well, that's one idea. Yet to be realised, and see what funding materialises over the next few weeks. But what story are these stakeholders telling? And I think there's part of me that understands I can do illustration. I can illustrate my own talks. I can illustrate the responses to other disciplinary research. But creating a narrative, I hardly dare yet. I don't know what narrative it. I think Abby's poetic response allows for ambiguity and uncertainty in a way which I'm not sure how something as tangible as the shadow puppet, which demands a story, can tell. We'll see.
Yeah. Maurice, do you have a response or a question to Kate or to Abbi's presentation?
Well, I was just very intrigued by both. Actually, I really like the idea, and I've been thinking already from, you know, maybe a future project also with this idea of poetry. You know, just taking real responses and reflections of people, and then, yeah, make a compilation of that, which is inspiring to read and says a lot about people's feeling, but also about a group's feeling. Actually, you make a collective statement. So I really found that very fascinating. Yeah, maybe I need some more time
to reflect more.
But I really, I also said before, and as I saw, I had the opportunity to see a draft version that I really liked. Also, just, you know, the power of some of the drawings, just a part of the content, but just I really like the drawing style and painting style that you applied. So it's just modest reflection from my side so far.
Yeah, I'm very fascinated by this interchange between art and science and the value that it creates. And I think many scientists are not common to that, are not used to that. So that I think that's very valuable to have this interchange. And there's a question from Roy to Abbi. Does Abbi also see a dichotomy between cultural heritage management and nature development in peatlands in the UK, as Maurice does in the Netherlands, or is there less tension? I don't know. Abbi, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Roy. Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? I think it's a while since I looked at the policy documents, so I think I would need to think about that a little bit more. I think what I can say about the qualitative work that I did was that when I asked people about what they understood wetland heritage to be generally, there was often a blurring of the natural and cultural heritage. So people sometimes included the stone circles in what they saw as the natural heritage of the landscape, which was really interesting to me. And in the same way, some aspects of what some people might perceive to be the nature of the landscape. So the way it's for Ilkley Moor, it's been managed as a grouse management, for shooting grouse in the past. It's been banned since 2018 on the moor, but in the past it was managed for that. So a lot of what people perceive to be the natural landscape is actually cultural. So things like the prevalence of heather on the moor and often trees as well. So I remember there was one participant who'd been talking to somebody and found that a clump of trees that they absolutely loved and were sort of part of nature were actually non-native species. And they were really unsure about what they felt about when those trees died, what should replace them. And so I think that, yes, there probably is some tensions in the management, but I think there's also tensions in individuals' perceptions of this landscape, in how they balance their views of what's natural and cultural heritage, and how should that be balanced in a way that still is the landscape that they love and they feel attached to.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection. I think it's really interesting, and perhaps we shouldn't think of black and white distinctions like that anyway. And I also had some problems with trying to interpret the prehistoric vegetation development of peatlands, for example, and to disentangle what was natural and what was cultural in the first place. So maybe it's not that easy, as you mentioned rightly. So thanks for that reflection.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Yeah, maybe this issue of like the cultural, I guess, shaping of peatlands is so far back, it's really hard to disentangle, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
Certainly, thank you for the question, Roy. So, well, and if there are no more questions, or if you have comments from your side, then I think we close the session.
I just want to thank you for showing us the Wageningen Moor peat monolith, which sets our discussions into such a kind depth.
Yes, I was looking for a piece this yesterday, and I only realized that it connected to Roy's speech of last series. But I was happy to see it here, that we could see it all together. Yeah. Okay, thanks again. So please be reminded that the last series, number 4, is on 24th of March, and that you can see all series back on YouTube as this is live recorded and then archived on YouTube. So hope to see you again on the 24th of March. Thanks for joining us. And thank you for Maurice, Kate, and Abbi.
Thank you, Abbi.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.